Hi, I'm Jimmy Colefax, and this is The Story. Today, Eric Scatterbo is chatting with Pete Court, who's a lecturer in creative writing at Tabor University in Adelaide. Pete's sharing his own personal story, which he's entered into several short story competitions. Before the break, Pete began to share about a profound conversation he had with a co-worker.
At this point, You're with your coworker, your longtime coworker, at his last day.
This is Rod, yeah.
And you're telling him the story of your heart surgery when you're 2 years old, and all of a sudden he starts crying.
Yeah.
What happens?
Yeah.
Can you read for us the short story about what happened next?
Sure. And because now looking back on it, it took me a long time to sort of come to terms with what had actually happened. Because he was very, very self-assured. He was really solid, one of these really smart people. They know what they're doing, and you know they're always in control. But he went on as we were sitting there that day. He said something along. He said, "Our daughter was in the Royal Adelaide. She was a tiny thing," he said, "and she was going to have an operation that would fix her up." His eyes left me. They looked back to the shiny linoleum room in the big hospital where his daughter had died, only a day away from the impossible surgery that had opened my chest. His voice continues to echo down those morning corridors. They asked us if they could use her body to try the surgery on her corpse before they did it for real. I stared at his distant eyes, the tears, the grown man with the daughter who had never grown up, this daughter who fell short of the dream, the prayers fallen still, the body failed. And then they had dared to ask if they could hack into her, to use her death, his grief, to help some other child, some stranger, some nobody he would probably never know. He looked up at me and I braced to see pain, maybe even accusation, blame perhaps. I was here and his daughter wasn't. He wipes at a tired eye and raises his bottle to me. "Well," he croaked, "it's good to meet you."
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was quite a moment. And the interesting thing that strikes me now is something that wasn't in the original story that I wrote. And I think this is the thing that has continued with me, I guess. That Rod, the chief engineer at KAFM at the time, was, I believe at the same time or just previously or whatever, had been heavily involved in the Christian radio station, Christian Community Radio as it was then. It was on the board, I think. And it was a radio station where I ended up again many years later working and producing breakfast and doing lots of work with. But I didn't know at that time that he was a Christian guy, that he was a man of faith. And I thought, the whole story for me had been about, wasn't it wonderful to be saved? And my parents who had gone with their prayer group and they had prayed faithfully and I had been saved. But so had he. I have no doubt that he and his friends and his church had spent many, many hours anguishing, praying for their daughter to live. And she didn't.
Yeah. That's the other
and
side.
It was, and the stunning thing is that it's not life or death. It wasn't me living and her dying or whatever that made the difference. It was being able to see each outcome as an incredibly valuable, powerful thing. And the fact that Rod actually lost his daughter is sad and tragic. But I know it had an enormous impact on him. And as a man of faith, it did have an enormous impact on him. And on me too, particularly.
So here it is, 25, 30 years later.
Yeah.
He had no idea whatever happened to that other little baby, the one that survived.
No.
Never knew. And you had been working together for several years.
We had been working together for a long time. In fact,
my goodness.
he had been working sort of around me and we had been working around each other for many years in different places. Yeah. That's the nature of the radio business, as you'd know. People all over the place. And those connections, it was amazing.
And if you hadn't had an open shirt that showed your scar, the conversation never would have come up.
No. If it had been just an ordinary, nice, comfortable, calm day, I probably would have been wearing one of my really cool rock and roll T-shirts. But I had an open neck, like a buttoned up shirt because it was so hot.
Yeah.
Weird, huh?
Yeah. And so you had this conversation and you met the father of the little girl who they had the practice operation on the day before they did it on you successfully.
Yeah. The stunning impact for me, I think, at the moment was that I had no idea they'd done that. You know,
Oh, you didn't know?
I didn't know that they'd been practicing on dead babies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which sounds brutal, but that's the fact. And it's a medical fact. They have to do it. And if I'd really sat down and thought about it, I goes, oh, okay, so how many people had to give up their lives so that I could have this successful operation?
Yeah.
And we forget that. We're so beautifully medically advanced now, sort of, that we forget how many people have died so that we can have this advance.
Yeah.
And so that we can be here. And it really does put into perspective what death actually means. It's no big deal, actually. It's usable as it is. It's not, I mean, it's as heartbreaking and as grieving as it is for us, it is not the end. It is just part of a process and a system, if you like, that's much bigger than our medical understanding.
So what impact did that moment have on you?
It took me a long time to finish the beer with him. I think it did drive home for me the fact that this was not an accident. It was not just luck. It was not just medical skill. It wasn't the right people in the right place at the right time, and it wasn't just an accident. My living and my being alive was not a mistake. It was a deliberate, planned process. And I can tell you a little bit more. I went looking further back through my life. I can see how this one surgery, if you will, has been touched on and has had enormous impact on lives of others as we've moved along. And I haven't even noticed. And it's God's been using this thing. And I didn't know. It's weird. Yeah.
So tell us about it. What are the other impacts that it's had?
Before I came to KAFM to work with Rod, who was leaving at the point of this story, I had worked with SAFM, which is the big old stereo station at the time. It was the biggest, number one-est radio station in Australia. It was doing hugely well. They had a breakfast show called The Morning Zoo, which starred a guy called John Vincent. People in Sydney would probably know Vinny. He was a huge DJ over there, did very well on the breakfast show. Then came to Adelaide to help set up the SAFM Morning Zoo. And I was taken on as their producer and comedy writer for the show, and got on very, very well with Vinny. He's one of these people. He's one of these people who in radio cares more about talking to people than talking about himself. And he's a really, really smart operator. He died a few years ago as a result of his heart condition, which is how we eventually bonded very strongly, because I mentioned the team coming from South Africa to perform the first ever open heart surgery on an infant, which was me.
Yeah.
The week before they did that, they were in Sydney performing the first ever open heart surgery on an adult in Australia. And that adult was a 21-year-old John Vincent.
Oh, my goodness.
Who I would, end up working with on the Morning Zoo.
Oh, my goodness, the connections.
The interesting thing, you ask about what impact this has had on my life.
Yeah.
This is probably the thing that had the most impact, actually, was finding out that Vinny was basically, we were heart brothers.
Yeah.
We were heart bros.
Yeah.
But what occurred, he was, as I said, he was 21. So he was pretty much a bloke. He had a career. He was professionally very successful when he had this surgery. But up till that point, he had been like I was before the surgery. I was slow-moving, unable to do much, very, very easily out of breath and stuff. So Vinny had grown up with this sort of this self-imposed persona of being a sports hater. His part of his image and his identity, even on air, was to not like sport, and he would mock the football season and laugh at cricket players and all that. That was part of who he was as a gag. It's like setting up Barry Manilow as your scapegoat. He would use sport as a scapegoat because he had never been able to do it. So he had developed this self-defense mechanism, I guess, that encapsulated who he was based on this. So he had never been able to do it. Then he had his surgery, and it wasn't particularly 100% successful because, it's still very new. They were still practicing it.
Yeah.
And he still continued, even when I was working with him 30 years later or something, as this I hate sport kind of guy. He didn't do a lot of exercise. He looked after himself a little better. He'd given up smoking. That was a good thing.
Yeah.
But he still had this anti-sport persona. On the other hand, I had parents who had said, let go. They had let go of what I was going to be when I was basically a year old. They said, this is not our child anymore, God. This is your kid. You do it. You do what you want. Let him be his thing. And so I had grown up never being told that there were things I should not do.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'd had open heart surgery as an infant, this open heart surgery that they didn't know was ever going to do anything, was going to work. They didn't know how bad it was going to be, but I had never been stopped from doing anything. So I started playing, continued to play sport, ended up playing at a very high level. I've always been fit and I've always been loving playing sport, and it is part now of my community, and also it's part of almost my spiritual life to be fit and to understand what fitness means and why it's so important and all this sort of stuff. And I love it,
Yeah.
Vinny, on the other hand, hated it. Why? Because it was who he was. It was what he had chosen to become. And that really struck me, that we can choose who we are based on what we tell ourselves, and that shapes enormously how we go about living our lives.
So quite a contrast between the impact the surgery had on you and on Vinny.
Yeah. I suspect that as Vinny was going through the process of getting ready for heart surgery, there weren't a whole lot of people praying for his well-being and his future. And I think that probably was borne out in his life.
Wow. So quite a contrast.
Yeah.
And now you're going from strength to strength, teaching people how to write effective short stories.
Yeah, well, that's one of the many things I'm doing with my time now. Yeah, we're keeping, and the short stories. Interestingly enough, the short stories that we've been collecting. I'm convening a thing called the Stories of Life competition, where people tell stories of faith and testimony. It's the only short story competition I know of in the world where the stories are also then recorded by the authors to be played on radio.
Oh.
So those stories will now be broadcast in Adelaide on Life FM.
And we are so thankful that you shared your story with us today. Thank you so much, Pete Court.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, I have to say that Pete's story is one of the best I've ever heard. And to think that he had been working with his co-worker Rod for several years without even knowing about the connection they had through the death of Rod's daughter. Incredible. As mentioned earlier, Pete is a lecturer in creative writing at Tabor in Adelaide, and he's also involved in something called the Stories of Life competition. That's where people from all over Australia submit short stories, and the finalists are included in a book each year. So, to find out more and to possibly submit a story of your own, the website is storiesoflife.net. Once again, that's storiesoflife.net. I just think it's great that Christians are using their creative gifts and skills for the Lord and expressing some profound experiences they've had in life, just like we heard today from Pete Court. Well, thanks for joining us for Pete's amazing story. I'm Jimmy Colefax, encouraging you to share your story with someone today.